When Derek Callahan, CEO of Northbridge Dynamics, stood up in the Monday strategy meeting and clicked to the next slide, my name was the first thing on it. Not at the bottom, not buried in a footnote. At the very top, in bold, under a header that read, Q3, Organizational Realignment, Compensation Adjustment, Tier 1. Maya Ellison, VP of Client Strategy. Base salary reduced 25% effective immediately. Quarterly performance bonus suspended pending review. I had closed a 9-figure renewal with Hale Industries 11 days earlier. I had personally flown to Singapore twice in the last quarter to keep our biggest account from walking after a delivery failure that wasn't even my team's fault. I had built the client relationships that made up 60% of Northbridge's recurring revenue. And there I was, first on a list, in a conference room full of people who had watched me do all of it. The room was quiet, except for the low whir of the projector fan. 12 people sat around the table. Nobody looked at me. A few people looked at their laptops, like the laptops had suddenly become fascinating. Derek stood at the head of the table, in the navy suit I had picked out for him 2 Christmases ago, and he did not look at me either. His voice was even, rehearsed, the voice he used on investor calls. The board asked leadership to model a leaner cost structure heading into next year. Senior staff will lead by example. I trust everyone on this list understands the reasoning. He said, the board asked. He did not say he had disagreed. He did not say he had fought for me. He said it like it was weather, like it was something that had simply happened to both of us, and he happened to be standing at the front of the room reading it off a screen. 3 seats down, a woman I had known for exactly 19 days tilted her head with practiced concern. Derek, isn't this a little sudden? Maya's handling so much right now. Won't this affect the Hale account? Her name was Vanessa Klein. Her title was Senior Strategic Advisor, a title that had been invented for her the week she arrived, a title with no defined scope and an office 2 doors from Derek's. She had a business card before she had a single client relationship. She sat in on executive meetings before she understood our org chart, and now she was expressing concern for me in a tone that made it sound like she was the one being reasonable in the room. Derek's face softened when he looked at her. It was such a small thing, the kind of shift you'd only catch if you'd spent 5 years learning every version of that face. His voice, which had been flat and corporate for me, warmed by 2 full degrees for her. The company doesn't run on who works hardest. It runs on the overall strategy. I need people who can see that. Someone near the end of the table coughed into their fist. I recognized the cough. It was Jordan Reyes, the account director I had personally trained, the one who had sat next to me on a red-eye flight 8 months earlier while we rebuilt a client proposal from scratch at 1 a.m. because our old draft had a critical pricing error I'd caught at the last minute. Jordan knew exactly how many hours I had put into this company. Jordan said nothing, because the person who had just said overall strategy was the man who signed everyone's checks. I looked down at my phone under the table and opened my email. A notification from HR had synced 2 minutes before the meeting started, CCing Derek, the CFO, and someone in the board office. Timestamp, 9:14 a.m. The meeting had started at 9:20. He had signed off on this before he ever walked into the room. I did something small. I took a screenshot of my phone, then quietly angled it up and took a photo of the slide on the screen, and forwarded both to my personal email. Nobody at the table noticed. Vanessa was still talking. Honestly, I'd take a cut too. I just got here. It doesn't feel right for Maya to carry this alone. Her voice was soft, careful. the kind of soft that photographs well in a boardroom. But I had walked past her desk enough times in the last 3 weeks to have seen, upside down, a printed org chart with sticky notes on it. Client strategy, Tier 1 accounts, Tier 2 accounts, Tier 3 accounts. Each one with an arrow drawn toward a box labeled Strategic Partnerships Group, Transitioning Q4. This was never just a pay cut. This was a slow, deliberate transfer of my clients, my team, and my budget into her column, 1 quarter at a time, dressed up as generosity. I almost laughed out loud. Not because it was funny, because it was so familiar it felt like déjà vu of my own life. 9 years earlier, Derek had sat on the floor of a 600-square-foot apartment in Austin, holding a business plan that 4 different investors had already rejected. And he'd looked up at me and said, "Maya, when this works, I'm going to make sure you have the best seat in the house." I believed him. I sat next to him at every pitch meeting after that. I answered client calls at midnight while he slept off the stress of the day. When our seed funding fell through the first time, I sold the small condo I'd bought before we ever met and used the money to make payroll for 2 months so our first 4 employees wouldn't walk. None of that ever made it into a company announcement. The only thing that had made it into a company announcement 9 years later was my name at the top of a pay cut list to make room for a woman who had been at the company for 19 days. Derek finally turned toward me, and for 1 second I thought he might say something real. "Maya, you've been here since the beginning. You, more than anyone, should understand the bigger picture." I had heard that phrase so many times it had lost its meaning, the way a word does when you repeat it out loud 50 times in a row. When Vanessa first joined and didn't understand our pricing model, and I spent 6 hours walking her through it, that was the bigger picture. When Derek's mother made a comment at Thanksgiving about how she'd always pictured Vanessa as the one running the company someday, and I let it go, that was the bigger picture. When Derek missed my birthday dinner to pick Vanessa up from the airport because, in his words, she'd just moved back to the country and didn't know anyone, that was also the bigger picture. And now, the woman who had personally built 60% of this company's recurring revenue was being asked to step back so a woman with 19 days of tenure could take her place. Also the bigger picture, apparently. I closed my laptop. It wasn't loud, but in a silent room it might as well have been a gunshot. Every head turned. Derek frowned. "The meeting isn't over." I stood and pushed my chair in, squaring it against the table the way I always did, out of habit, out of the same discipline that had made me good at this job for 9 years. "My part in it is." Vanessa flinched, and her face rearranged itself instantly into something soft and worried. "Maya, please, don't misunderstand. Derek didn't mean it like that. If you're upset, I can talk to HR for you." "You don't have to," I said, looking directly at her for the first time since I'd walked in that morning. "You're not the one who signed the list." Her face went pale. Derek's voice dropped low, the private register he used when he wanted to remind me we were supposedly on the same team. "Maya, this is the office." "I know." I picked up my phone and turned the screen toward him, showing him the email I had just forwarded to myself, which is why I'm going to follow proper procedure. I turned and walked out of the conference room. Behind me, I heard a sharp intake of breath, and then Derek's voice, calling my name once, flat and startled, like he genuinely hadn't expected the floor to move under him. I did not turn around. The hallway outside the conference room was long, lined with glass on both sides, and I could see my own reflection walking beside me the whole way. No tears, no shaking hands, I was calmer than I had been walking into that meeting an hour earlier, which surprised me more than anything else that morning. The receptionist at the front desk, a young guy named Owen who always kept a bowl of peppermints on his counter for nervous clients, half stood when he saw my face. "Ms. Ellison, is Priya in?" "In her office, yeah." I nodded and kept walking toward Human Resources. My phone buzzed in my hand. A text from Derek. "Don't make a scene. Keep this professional." I read it twice, then took a screenshot and saved it in the same folder as everything else. He genuinely believed I was about to have a meltdown in the hallway. 9 years of marriage, and he still thought the version of me that existed only in his head, the one who needed to be managed, soothed, kept calm, was the real one. Priya Malhotra's office door was half open. She looked up when I stepped in, and her expression moved through 3 stages in about 2 seconds. Surprise, recognition, and then something that looked almost like relief, as if she'd been waiting for this moment without knowing it. "Maya." She stood. I set my phone on her desk, screen up, showing the Q3 slide. "I need to process my resignation. Today." She stared at the screen for a long moment. "Today? Does Derek know?" "He personally told me 10 minutes ago that the company doesn't run on who works hardest." I kept my voice even. "So yes, he knows." Priya didn't say anything right away. She had been in HR at Northbridge for 5 years. She had seen me revise proposals at 3 in the morning in the small conference room down the hall. She had also been standing next to me at last year's investor dinner when Derek handed the first glass of champagne to a client and, in the process of introducing the table, somehow forgot to introduce his own wife, who was standing directly beside him. She hadn't said anything then either, but I remembered the look on her face, and I saw the same look now. She opened her system and started typing, then paused. "Maya, you're in a critical role. Standard notice is 30 days for anyone at your level." I slid a folder across her desk. Inside was every open project timeline, every client contact, every contract milestone and renewal date, a full risk assessment on each active account, updated the night before, though I hadn't known then that I'd be using it this soon. I had simply gotten into the habit, over the years, of keeping my own house in order in case I ever needed to leave it quickly. Some instinct in me had been preparing for this exit long before I consciously decided to walk out of that meeting. "Whoever takes over can sign off starting this afternoon," I said. "I don't leave loose ends." Priya looked up at me, and I could see her understanding shift. This wasn't a woman storming out in anger. This was a woman who had planned her exit route for longer than anyone in that building realized. 10 minutes later, the resignation was submitted. A notification popped up on the screen. Request entered approval queue. At almost the same moment, I heard fast footsteps coming down the hall from the direction of the conference room. Derek appeared in the doorway, jaw tight, tie slightly crooked from moving too fast. "Maya, come out here." I didn't move. "If you have something to say it here." Priya suddenly became very interested in her monitor. Derek's voice tightened further, controlled anger doing its best to sound like calm reason. "Do you understand what you're doing right now?" "Resigning." "Over a compensation list? Maya, be reasonable." He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture I recognized from every difficult client call he'd ever had to make. "Vanessa just got here. She's still finding her footing. I'll move you back into the client strategy lead role in 3 months, once things settle." "You don't have to blow this up right now," he added, quieter, as if that were the actual problem, not that he'd humiliated me in front of 12 people, but that I was making it visible. A couple of employees walking past in the hallway slowed their pace without quite stopping. Vanessa had followed him down and was now hovering a few feet behind, eyes glassy, holding a folder to her chest like a shield. I looked at Derek and felt the last thread of any desire to explain myself simply detach and drift away, the way a kite string goes slack the moment the wind dies. "So, in your head," I said slowly, "being publicly demoted, having my clients reassigned, and being told to be grateful you'll consider giving me my job back in 3 months, that's all just Vanessa being new and difficult. And your compromise is offering to eventually return what was already mine." His jaw worked. "That's not what Mr. Callahan!" I said it flatly, no inflection, testing the words in my mouth. "The handover is complete. I've already sent full project files to HR and to your office. Contract terms, active risk items, outstanding client concerns, all archived per policy." His face changed. "What did you just call me?" "In the office, that's your title. As for home," I glanced at the small gold bands on my left hand, the one I'd worn for 5 years, engraved on the inside with 2 words neither of us had said to each other in longer than I wanted to admit. "We'll talk tonight." I heard Vanessa whisper behind him, barely audible. "Derek, did I cause this?" He didn't answer her. That, more than anything else that morning, told me everything I needed to know about where his loyalties actually sat, even if he hadn't consciously sorted it out himself yet. I walked past both of them toward the elevator. The doors opened and I stepped inside, and in the polished steel reflection, I watched the ring on my finger catch the fluorescent light. I had worn it for 5 years. I slipped it off, and for a second the bare skin underneath felt strange, pale, unused to open air. I dropped it into the zippered pocket of my bag. The doors closed. This time, I wasn't holding anything up for anyone. By the time I reached the ground floor, my phone had already logged 6 missed calls, 4 from Derek, 2 from Vanessa's extension, which was strange, since she and I had never once exchanged phone numbers. I didn't return any of them. Owen watched me cross the lobby toward the revolving doors, his eyes red-rimmed in a way that made me suspect he'd overheard more of the hallway conversation than I would have liked. "Ms. Ellison, you're really leaving?" I unclipped my badge and set it on the reception counter. "Yes." He opened his mouth like he wanted to say something more, but nothing came out. I understood. There wasn't really anything left to say. Outside, the morning air had the sharp, clean bite of early fall. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, looking up at the Northbridge Dynamics logo etched into the glass above the entrance, a logo I had helped choose from 4 different design mock-ups 9 years earlier, sitting cross-legged on our apartment floor with a laptop balanced on a stack of unpacked moving boxes. Then I turned and walked toward the parking garage, and I did not look back. The house Derek and I bought in our 2nd year of marriage sat on a quiet street with old maple trees that turned brilliant orange every October. I had designed the layout with an architect friend. I had picked the reclaimed oak beam over the kitchen island. Even the small brass tray we kept by the front door for loose keys was something I'd found on a work trip to Portland and carried home wrapped in a sweater in my carry-on. That afternoon, standing in the entryway with my hand still on the door, the house felt like a place I was visiting rather than a place I lived. I didn't turn on the living room lights. I went straight to the study. There was a safe bolted into the closet floor, installed the year we started the company, back when we kept physical copies of early investor agreements because neither of us fully trusted the cloud yet. I hadn't opened it in over a year. I knelt down and entered the code. Inside were 3 folders I had built and rebuilt over the years without ever quite admitting to myself why. The first held copies of every contract I'd personally negotiated at Northbridge, going back to year 1, including the earliest agreements before we'd even incorporated properly. The second held our marriage's financial documents, the joint accounts, but also, separately, the paperwork from the sale of my premarital condo, the wire transfer record showing exactly how much of that money had gone directly into Northbridge's second payroll run when our funding fell through. The third folder was the one I hadn't looked at in 3 years. It was labeled in my own handwriting from a decade earlier, Ellison Predictive Systems, Provisional Patent. Before I met Derek, before Northbridge existed, I had spent 2 years of graduate research building a client behavior prediction algorithm, the mathematical backbone that would eventually become the core engine inside Northbridge's flagship product. I had filed a provisional patent under my maiden name, Ellison, the year before I dropped out of the PhD program to help Derek get his first pitch deck together. When we built the company, we'd been so broke and so in love and so certain the two of us were permanently the same entity that I never formally assigned the patent to Northbridge. There had simply never been a reason to. We were us. What was mine was the company's, and what was the company's was ours. I sat on the study floor with that folder open in my lap for a long time. I wasn't thinking about revenge. Not yet. I was thinking about the sheer dumb luck of having once been careless in exactly the right direction. Of having let a lawyer friend talk me into filing that provisional patent just to be safe, years before I had any idea I would ever need to be safe from the man I was about to marry. I photographed every page. Then I called a lawyer. Not Northbridge's lawyer, not Derek's family lawyer who had handled our prenup, a document Derek's mother had insisted on, ironically, to protect the company's assets from me, never once imagining the protection might someday run in the other direction. I called David Okafor, an intellectual property attorney I'd met years earlier at a conference and stayed loosely in touch with, the kind of contact you keep in your phone for exactly the day you hope never comes. Maya, it's been a while. David, I need you to look at something. Today, if you can. I sent him the scanned patent documents while we were still on the phone. There was a long pause on his end while he skinned. This was never formally assigned to Northbridge? No. And the product built on this algorithm is currently generating what, exactly? I told him. Northbridge's core platform, the predictive client engagement engine that powered every account we sold, the thing that made our renewal rates so much higher than competitors. The thing David Bennett, no, I caught myself. The client's name was Robert Hale. The thing Robert Hale's company specifically cited as the reason they'd stayed with us through 2 rocky delivery quarters. That entire engine sat on top of the math I had built a decade ago and never formally signed away. David exhaled slowly. Maya, I need to be honest with you. This is either nothing because a court could find implied license through years of use and marital commingling of assets, or it's the single biggest piece of leverage I've seen walk into my office in a decade. It depends entirely on how this plays out from here. Don't do anything with it yet. Don't mention it to Derek. Let me build the position properly first. Understood. And Maya, for what it's worth, I'm sorry. I thanked him and hung up, then sat there a while longer with the folder closed in my lap, feeling something shift quietly inside my chest. Not triumph exactly. More like the sensation of a door I hadn't known was locked, suddenly swinging open a few inches. I spent the next 2 hours packing. Not everything. I wasn't trying to empty the house in an afternoon. Just what I needed. Clothes, my laptop and its accessories, the framed photo of my grandmother that had sat on my nightstand since before Derek and I ever met, the small potted fern by the kitchen window that I'd kept alive for 6 years, despite killing every other plant I'd ever owned. I ordered a car to take me to a hotel downtown. One Derek wouldn't think to check first, since it wasn't the one we usually stayed in for anniversaries. At 7 that evening, as I stood in the hotel room unpacking the fern onto the windowsill, My phone buzzed. Derek. We'll talk when you get home tonight. I looked at the message for a long moment before typing back 4 words. I'm not coming home. 3 dots appeared, disappeared, appeared again. Finally, where are you? I didn't answer. I turned my phone face down on the desk and looked out at the city skyline instead. The last orange light of the day sliding off the tops of the buildings. And for the first time since that morning, I let myself sit with the fact that 9 years of my life had just quietly ended in a conference room over a slide deck in under 4 minutes. The next morning, I woke up in the hotel room to sunlight instead of the usual sound of Derek's alarm. And for a full 10 seconds, I forgot where I was. Then I remembered. And instead of the dread I expected, I felt something closer to clarity. My phone had 14 new messages. 2 from Priya at HR confirming my resignation had entered final processing. 1 from Marcus, an old college friend, who had somehow already heard through the industry grapevine that I'd left Northbridge and wanted to know if I was okay. And 1 from a number I didn't recognize, a Chicago area code. Ms. Ellison, this is Robert Hale's office. Mr. Hale would like to speak with you directly regarding the transition. Please call at your earliest convenience. Robert Hale ran Hale Industries, our single largest account, the client I had personally flown to see twice in the last quarter, the client whose renewal I had closed 11 days before that meeting. I stared at the message for a long moment, weighing what I owed to a company I no longer worked for against what I owed to a relationship I'd spent 3 years building with genuine care, not just as a line item on a sales report. I called him back. Maya. His voice was warm, the same warmth it always carried, but underneath it I could hear something careful, something testing the ground before stepping onto it. I heard he left Northbridge. I did. Effective immediately or... Effective immediately. A pause. That's not how these things usually go for someone at your level. No, I agreed. It isn't. But I wanted to be straightforward with you, since our relationship has always been built on that. I formally resigned. I no longer represent Northbridge in any capacity. Not in pricing conversations, not in delivery commitments, not in anything. If your team has questions about the transition, they'll need to go through whoever Derek assigns to your account going forward. Which is who? I hesitated for exactly 1 second. I'd let Northbridge tell you that directly. He was quiet for a moment. Off the record, Maya, is there something I should be worried about? I can't speak to Northbridge's internal decisions anymore. I can only tell you that I'm no longer the person managing your account, and that anything promised to you from this point forward, you should get in writing. Understood. Another pause, longer this time. For what it's worth, working with you was the best part of this whole account. I hope wherever you land next, you'll let me know. After we hung up, I did exactly what David had told me to do days earlier, though at the time I hadn't understood why he'd been so specific about it. I sent a brief, formal email to Robert Hale confirming in writing the date of my resignation and the fact that I no longer had authority to make commitments on Northbridge's behalf. I copied Northbridge's general project inbox. Simple, clean. A single paragraph. Nothing accusatory, nothing dramatic, just a clear line drawn in ink so that nobody could later claim I had misrepresented anything, and so that if Northbridge's next move with that account went badly, the timeline would show exactly whose hands had been on the wheel when it happened. 15 minutes later, Derek called. I answered, and out of habit, or maybe out of the instinct that had started forming the moment I walked out of that conference room, I tapped the record button before I said hello. Derek, this call is being recorded. There was a pause, long enough that I could picture the look on his face. Why would you... What's the meaning of that email you sent Robert Hale? He demanded, skipping straight past my question. It means exactly what it says. You know how much he relies on you personally. What do you think he's going to assume, getting an email like that, on the same day you leave? My voice stayed level. He'll assume the lines of responsibility have changed, which they have. Maya, you can resign. I understand you're angry, but don't sabotage the company on your way out the door. Am I the one sabotaging it? I asked. Before Vanessa takes over that account, has anyone walked her through the delivery history? The 3 outstanding technical issues from last quarter? The fact that Robert's CFO specifically asked for weekly written updates after the last delay? Silence on the other end. She's smart, Derek said finally, defensive now. She'll catch up. I'm sure she will. In the meantime, I'd strongly suggest someone brief her properly, because right now she's inheriting my most demanding account with none of the context, and that's going to show up fast. Can you just brief her privately, as a professional courtesy? I actually laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. Derek, you demoted me publicly, handed my accounts to a woman with 19 days of tenure, and now you're asking me to quietly train my own replacement, off the clock, as a favor. Do you hear how that sounds? He didn't answer right away, which told me he did, in fact, hear exactly how it sounded, and simply didn't have a response that wouldn't make it worse. Come home tonight, he said instead, quieter. We need to actually talk, not like this. I'm not coming home. Then I'll come to you. Which hotel? I glanced at my phone screen, where I'd already disabled location sharing the night before, a small, almost automatic act of self-protection that surprised even me with how naturally it had come. That's not something you need to know right now. He exhaled hard, the sound of a man biting back something sharper. You're really doing this. I already did it, I said. Yesterday, in a conference room in front of 12 people, when you decided the bigger picture didn't have room for me in it anymore. I hung up before he could respond. That afternoon, Jordan Reyes called from what sounded like a stairwell, voice low and urgent. Maya, things are a mess over here. Vanessa's asking for full access to all the client files, including your old private notes, the informal stuff, not the official documentation. My private notes weren't confidential business secrets. They were the accumulated texture of years of relationship building. Which client's father was in poor health? Which account manager was quietly job hunting? Which technical lead hated Friday afternoon calls and would only engage seriously on Tuesdays? That kind of knowledge doesn't transfer through a spreadsheet. It transfers through years of paying close attention to people. And it wasn't something I was willing to hand over to someone who'd been in the building for less than 3 weeks. Per policy, I told Jordan, you're only required to hand over formally archived documentation. Personal notes aren't part of any handover obligation. You're not required to give her access to those. I heard him exhale in relief. Got it. I'll pass that along to the team. A pause. Maya, are you really not coming back? I looked out the hotel window at the traffic moving steadily below. People going about ordinary days that had nothing to do with mine. Jordan, don't build your hopes around someone who's already left the building. Protect your own position. That's what matters now. He was quiet for a long moment before he said, Understood, and hung up. At 9 that night, another text came through from Derek. Vanessa got grilled by Hale's team on the call today. Cried afterward. Are you happy now? I stared at the screen for a while before I typed back. Asking questions isn't grilling. Not being able to answer them is the actual problem. He didn't reply. I set the phone down on the nightstand, turned off the lamp, and lay in the dark hotel room listening to the quiet hum of the air conditioning, thinking that somewhere across the city, in the house I had designed and no longer lived in, my husband, soon to be my ex-husband, though neither of us had said the word yet, was probably lying awake too, wondering how a 9-year marriage and a company we'd built together from a laptop on the floor of a 600-square-foot apartment had unraveled in under 30 hours. I wasn't wondering the same thing. I already knew the answer. It hadn't unraveled in 30 hours. It had been unraveling for months, maybe longer, and I had simply been the last one in the building to admit it out loud. On the second day, I got a message from Lily Chen, a finance manager I'd worked closely with for years, someone who had never once been part of the office politics and had always simply done her job with a quiet, careful integrity that I respected more than almost anyone else at Northbridge. She sent a screenshot with no message attached at first, just the image. It was a budget approval showing a new line item. Strategic Partnerships, Client Relationship Restoration, $180,000, approved by Derek Callahan, effective immediately. A minute later, her actual message came through. Maya, I don't know if this is relevant to you anymore, but I thought you should see it. That budget came directly out of the Delivery Assurance Fund your team had allocated for Q4. Vanessa requested it 2 days ago, said it was for, quote, brand image maintenance and client entertainment. I stared at the screenshot for a long time. $180,000, pulled from the exact fund my team had spent an entire quarter fighting to secure, meant to cover engineering overtime and contingency support for exactly the kind of delivery failures that had almost cost us the Hale account twice already, redirected in less than 48 hours into a line item with no clear deliverable attached to it at all. She couldn't manage the accounts, so she was trying to buy her way through the parts she couldn't do the actual work for. I typed back, "Thank you, Lily. This helps more than you know." "Does it count as anything?" she asked. "I don't know how these things work." "It counts," I told her. And I saved the screenshot into a folder I'd started calling, without much ceremony, Timeline. That folder was growing. The Q3 realignment slide, the client transition org chart with Vanessa's box drawn over mine, the text messages from Derek, the budget diversion. Individually, each piece looked like nothing more than an ordinary internal decision, the kind of thing that happens at every company during a leadership shift. Together, laid end to end with dates attached, they formed something else entirely. A pattern, deliberate and sustained, of a company being quietly hollowed out from the inside to make room for someone who had done nothing yet to earn the space. I hadn't planned any of this as a campaign. I want to be honest about that, even now, looking back. I wasn't building a case in some calculated chess move way from the very first hour. I was simply doing what I had always done, documenting, protecting myself, refusing to be caught without a paper trail. It just so happened that the habit I'd built over 9 years of protecting the company was now, for the first time, protecting me instead. On the morning of the third day, Northbridge began to come apart at the seams, and I heard about almost all of it secondhand because nobody there thought to call me directly anymore. I was, as far as the org chart was concerned, already a ghost. Robert Hale's company sent a formal letter, restrained, careful corporate language, requesting a pause in project progression pending a reassessment of delivery risk, citing the recent change in account leadership. 2 other long-standing clients quietly requested to delay their renewal conversations for similar reasons. Nobody used the word unstable out loud, but it was there, underneath every sentence, the way a bruise is there under skin that hasn't quite broken yet. Jordan called me again that afternoon, his voice tight in a way I hadn't heard from him before. The whole department feels like it's holding its breath. Vanessa's been in Derek's office since 8 this morning. A couple of the project leads got so heated in a meeting I genuinely thought someone was going to throw a laptop across the table. I felt no satisfaction hearing it, which surprised me a little. I had expected, somewhere in the back of my mind, that watching things fall apart over there might feel like vindication. Instead, it just felt sad, in a distant, muted sort of way. Like watching a house you used to live in slowly catch fire from a safe distance across the street. You don't want it to burn, exactly, but you also understand, with total clarity, that you're the only one who knows where all the exits are, and you're no longer the one responsible for finding them. At 10:40 that morning, Priya messaged me from HR. Maya, Derek is in my office right now. He's asking me to retract your resignation. Wants to know if it's possible to reverse it before it fully processes. I read the message twice and didn't respond right away. A minute later, Priya sent another line. He looks like he hasn't slept. I still didn't reply. Less than a minute after that, my phone rang, Derek's name on the screen. I let it ring twice, took a breath, and answered, tapping the record button out of habit before I even said hello. Derek, this call's being recorded. A pause, shorter this time than it had been 2 days earlier, like he was starting to expect it. Maya, I need you to come back. Not eventually. Now. Why? Because the company is falling apart and everyone in this building knows it's because you left. And I'm not... He stopped himself, breathed out hard. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that isn't true. You should have thought about that before you put my name at the top of a list. I know that. His voice cracked slightly on the word no, and for a second, just a second, I almost believed there was something real underneath it. I know that, Maya. I've had 3 days to think about it, and I know exactly how badly I got this wrong. Then what exactly are you asking me for? Come back. We'll figure out the rest. Your title, your compensation, whatever needs fixing, we'll fix it. Just come back and help me stabilize the Hale account before it walks entirely. I sat with that for a moment, turning it over. Not you, Maya. I'm sorry. I want to fix this because I love you and I was wrong. Come back and help me stabilize the account. Even now, 3 days into the wreckage, the ask was still framed entirely around what the company needed from me, not what he owed me. Derek, I said finally, I'm not coming back to fix a fire I didn't start. You didn't start it, but you can put it out. Nobody else understands that account the way you do. That's exactly the problem, I said. You built an entire company on the assumption that I would always be the one who understood everything, who fixed everything, who absorbed every risk quietly enough that you never had to notice the weight of it. And the first time someone new caught your attention, you decided that understanding didn't matter anymore. So no, I'm not coming back to prop this up. You'll have to find out what happens when the person absorbing all the risk finally puts it down. There was a long silence on the line. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost defeated. Is there anything I can say that would change your mind? Not today, I said. and I meant it as the closest thing to an honest answer I had. Not never, not today. I hung up first this time. Jordan called me again on the evening of the third day, later than he usually would, his voice pitched low the way it got when he didn't want to be overheard. "They called an emergency all-hands," he said. Derek stood up in the main atrium and tried to give one of his usual speeches, steady hand on the wheel, we've weathered storms before, all of that. Except this time, nobody was buying it. Someone actually asked, out loud, in front of the whole department, whether it was true that the Hale account was on the verge of walking because the person who understood it best had been pushed out to make room for someone who couldn't answer basic delivery questions. What did he say? He said the company was undergoing necessary changes and asked everyone to trust the process. Jordan let out a short, humorless laugh. "Maya, nobody trusts the process. The process put your name at the top of a slide 11 days after you closed the biggest renewal of the year. Everyone in that room has done the math. They know exactly what happened, even if nobody's saying it directly." I sat with the phone against my ear, looking out at the city skyline from my hotel window, and felt a strange, layered mixture of emotions I couldn't easily separate from one another. A distant, muted sympathy for the people still caught inside that atrium. Genuine concern for Jordan and Marcus, and everyone else still trying to hold their footing on ground that kept shifting under them. And underneath all of it, something quieter and harder to name. A kind of settled certainty that none of this chaos was actually mine to fix anymore. "How's Vanessa handling it?" I asked, mostly out of a curiosity I wasn't proud of. "Badly. She left the atrium halfway through the all-hands. I heard she's been in Derek's office since. Someone said she was crying, but I didn't see it myself, so I can't confirm that." He paused. "Honestly, Maya, I almost feel bad for her. Almost. She got put into a job she wasn't remotely prepared for, by people who wanted something from her that had nothing to do with whether she could actually do the work. And now she's the one standing in the wreckage while everyone assumes she's the villain of the story." I thought about that for a moment, turning it over honestly rather than dismissing it out of hand. "I don't think she's a villain, Jordan. I think she's a person who accepted a role she should have questioned more carefully, propped up by people who had their own reasons for wanting her there, and now she's discovering the hard way that being handed a title isn't the same as being prepared for what the title actually requires. That's not villainy. It's just a hard public lesson, learned in the worst possible circumstances. That's more generous than I'd be able to manage if it were me." "Maybe," I said, "but it doesn't cost me anything to see it clearly. The people who put her in that position without preparing her for it are the ones I hold responsible. She's just the most visible casualty of a decision that was never really about her competence to begin with." The following morning, the fallout accelerated in a way none of us had fully anticipated. A second major client, a logistics conglomerate that had been with Northbridge for 4 years, one of the accounts I'd personally onboarded back when the company was still small enough that I handled every major relationship myself, sent formal notice that they were pausing their contract renewal discussions entirely, pending what their letter described as clarity on the company's operational leadership and account continuity. Lily forwarded me the internal memo circulating about it, not because she thought I needed to know, but because, in her words, everyone here already assumes you're the only one who can actually explain what's happening, even though technically you don't work here anymore. The memo, drafted by the interim head of client strategy, a mid-level manager named Sanjay Patel, who had been thrust into a leadership vacuum nobody had prepared him for either, was almost painfully honest in its internal language, clearly never intended to leave the building. It read, in part, We are experiencing significant institutional knowledge loss across our top-tier accounts following recent leadership changes. Several client relationships were managed through informal, relationship-based continuity that was never fully documented in our CRM systems. We are working to rebuild this continuity, but expect further account attrition in the near term. I read that memo twice, sitting alone in my hotel room, and felt something close to vindication mixed uncomfortably with something closer to grief. Vindication because it confirmed, in black and white, internal corporate language, exactly what I had always known to be true. That the relationships I'd built over years were never adequately documented anywhere except inside my own head and my own habits. Because nobody had ever asked me to formalize them. Because nobody had ever imagined a version of the company that didn't have me quietly holding all of it together. Grief, because reading it also meant confronting, plainly, just how replaceable I had actually been treated as, right up until the exact moment my absence made that treatment impossible to sustain. That afternoon, Derek called for the third time that week, and this time, when I answered, his voice sounded different, less controlled, less certain, the practiced CEO cadence finally cracking under real pressure rather than performed pressure. Maya, I need you to understand something. This isn't about pride anymore. 2 more clients are threatening to walk. If we lose the logistics account on top of Hale scaling back, we're looking at a revenue hit that could trigger covenant issues with our lenders. This isn't a hypothetical anymore. This could genuinely sink the company. I understand the stakes, Derek. I've understood them since before you did. Then help me, please. Not for me, for Jordan, for Marcus, for the 80 other people whose jobs are on the line if this actually goes as badly as it's starting to look. I sat with that appeal for a long moment, because unlike his earlier attempts, this one wasn't dressed up in ego or wounded pride. It was, at least on its surface, an appeal to people I actually cared about. People who had nothing to do with the decision that had put my name on that list. Derek, I said finally, I care about Jordan and Marcus and everyone else in that building. That's exactly why I spent 9 years building the relationships that are currently the only thing standing between this company and the covenant issue you're describing. But I'm not going to walk back into a building that demoted me publicly and handed my life's work to someone unqualified, just because the consequences of that decision finally became visible enough to frighten you. If you want to protect those 80 jobs, the actual solution isn't me. It's honest, competent, properly documented account management handled by whoever's actually qualified to do it. Starting with treating your remaining team with enough respect and stability that they don't all quietly start looking for the exit themselves. He was quiet for a long moment. You really won't come back, even for them. I'm not coming back for anyone, I said, but that doesn't mean I don't wish them well. There's a difference, Derek, even if you've never quite been able to see it. He didn't have a response for that. We hung up without any real resolution, and over the following days I watched, mostly through Jordan's increasingly exhausted updates, as Northbridge scrambled to stabilize what it could, losing the logistics account entirely 2 weeks later, narrowly retaining Hale on the reduced 1-year terms, and beginning, in fits and starts, the long, uneven process of rebuilding institutional trust that would eventually, months later, lead the board to remove Derek from his role and bring in Patricia Suarez to steady the ship. I didn't feel responsible for any of it. And I want to be honest about that because it would be easy, in telling this story, to cast myself as some architect of Northbridge's decline, orchestrating its collapse from a hotel room out of quiet vengeance. That wasn't what happened. I simply stopped absorbing risk that was never mine to carry alone in the first place. And the company, once that absorption stopped, revealed exactly how much of its stability had always depended on a single person's invisible, uncompensated labor, rather than any real structural resilience. That wasn't sabotage. That was just what happens when you finally see, clearly and for the first time, the actual shape of the thing you've been holding up. The piece I hadn't understood yet, the piece that reframed everything once I finally saw it, came from an unexpected source 4 days after I walked out. Her name was Renee Castellano, and she'd worked as Derek's mother's personal assistant for almost as long as I'd known the family. I'd always liked Renee, in the careful, guarded way you like someone whose loyalty technically belongs to someone else. We'd exchanged pleasantries at family dinners for years, nothing more. So when she texted me out of nowhere asking if we could meet for coffee, I almost didn't recognize the number. We met at a small cafe 2 neighborhoods away from anywhere either of our families frequented. Renee looked nervous in a way I hadn't seen from her before, turning her cup in slow circles on the table before she finally spoke. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this," she said, "but I've watched what's happened over the last few days and I can't sit with it anymore." "Tell me what?" She took a breath. "Vanessa Klein isn't just some hire who came out of nowhere. Her father is Richard Klein. He's been a silent board member at Northbridge since the Series B round, back when the company needed capital and Derek's mother brought him in as a favor. Nobody outside the board really knows his name because he's never wanted the visibility, but he holds almost 11%. I felt something cold settle in my chest. I've never heard Richard Klein mentioned once, not in a single board deck. He's kept it that way on purpose. And Vanessa, Renee hesitated, choosing her next words carefully. Vanessa and Derek dated, years before you. Before Northbridge existed, even. It ended badly, not dramatically, just quietly, the way things end when 2 families had already assumed a future together, and the 2 people involved simply didn't want the same thing anymore. Derek's mother never fully let go of that assumption. She spent years hoping, in this vague, persistent way, that it would eventually circle back around. When Vanessa moved back to the country a few months ago, freshly out of a failed venture of her own, Derek's mother saw an opportunity, and Richard Klein saw one too, from a completely different angle. What angle? Leverage, Renee said simply. Richard's been quietly unhappy with Derek's decision-making for over a year. Cost overruns, missed board targets, a couple of expansion bets that didn't pay off the way Derek promised they would. Getting his daughter installed in a senior role, close to Derek, with an office 2 doors down and a seat in every strategy meeting, that's not romance for Richard. That's oversight. A direct line into the company's decision-making that doesn't have to go through a formal board vote. And Derek's mother let it happen, or maybe even encouraged it, because in her mind it solved 2 problems at once. It gave Richard the influence he wanted, and it gave her the daughter-in-law she'd always pictured. I sat back in my chair, the cafe noise fading into a low hum around me while I turned that over. It wasn't just a rival trying to climb over me for a job. It was a quiet, years-long campaign orchestrated by 2 people who had never once needed to explain themselves to me because I had never been considered a threat worth explaining anything to. Derek's own negligence, his willingness to look away from what was obviously happening in front of him, his eagerness to believe his mother's version of the bigger picture, had made him either an active participant in it or, at best, a man too comfortable and too conflict-averse to notice he was being maneuvered. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked Renee finally. She looked down at her cup. Because I've spent 6 years watching you build that company with your own hands, and I've spent the last few days watching them erase you from the story like you were never really in it. I don't think that's fair, and honestly, I don't think Derek even fully understands what he's let happen. He's not smart enough about his own family to see it. He never has been. I thanked her and meant it, and we didn't discuss it further. But that afternoon, I sat in my hotel room and looked at the timeline folder on my laptop with new eyes. Every piece I'd already gathered, the realignment slide, the transition chart, the budget diversion, suddenly sat inside a much larger frame. This wasn't a husband making a careless, self-interested mistake in favor of a work crush. This was a board member using his daughter as a lever to pull influence over a company he'd quietly grown unhappy with, and a mother-in-law who had never once seen me as anything but an obstacle to a marriage she'd always wanted for someone else's daughter. I called David Okafor again. "I need you to add something to the file," I told him, and explained everything Renee had told me. He was quiet for a long moment on the other end. "Maya, if even half of that is accurate and documentable, this isn't just an employment dispute anymore. If Richard Klein used undisclosed board influence to install a family member into a senior operational role for the purpose of steering company decisions without proper governance disclosure, that's a fiduciary problem the other board members are going to want to know about, especially the ones who don't already have a personal stake in protecting Derek." "Can you find out who those other board members are?" "I can find out a lot of things," David said. "Give me a few days." I hung up and sat in the quiet of the hotel room, the city lights starting to come on outside the window, and felt something shift inside me that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite triumph. It was closer to clarity, the specific, almost peaceful clarity that comes from finally understanding the actual shape of a thing you'd spent years only feeling the edges of. I hadn't been demoted because Vanessa was more talented, or because the company genuinely needed a leaner cost structure, or because Derek had simply fallen for someone new. I had been demoted because I was standing, without ever realizing it, directly in the path of two people who wanted something from my husband that had nothing to do with love and everything to do with control. And my husband, whether through blindness or convenience, had let them use me as the price of getting it. I picked up my phone and, for the first time since I'd left, I didn't feel the urge to check if Derek had called. David Okafor called me back 6 days after I walked out of Northbridge, and this time, his voice had a different energy to it, sharper, more focused. "Maya, I've had 2 other attorneys on my team dig through the corporate filings in the original patent assignment paperwork from when Northbridge incorporated. I want you to understand exactly what I'm about to tell you, because it changes the entire shape of your leverage." "Go on." "The provisional patent you filed under Ellison Predictive Systems was never converted to a full patent, and more importantly, it was never formally assigned to Northbridge Dynamics at incorporation. There's a single line in the original IP assignment agreement, the one you and Derek both signed 9 years ago, that lists existing proprietary algorithms contributed by founding members as being assigned in principle pending formal documentation. That documentation was never completed. Nobody ever circled back to finish it. For 9 years, Northbridge has been running its entire flagship predictive engagement engine on top of intellectual property that, legally, still belongs to you." I sat very still, the phone pressed to my ear, the hum of the hotel room's air conditioner suddenly very loud. "What does that mean, practically?" Practically, it means you have real, enforceable leverage. Not theoretical, real. If you wanted to, you could file to formally reclaim the IP and either license it back to Northbridge under new terms or decline to license it at all, which, given that it's the mathematical core of their entire product, would be catastrophic for them. I'm not telling you to do that. I'm telling you it's an option that exists. And now that you know about it, you get to decide what to do with it. I thought about Derek's voice on the phone 4 days earlier, cracking slightly on the word no. I thought about Richard Klein's quiet 11% and Vanessa's empty title, and the way Derek's mother had spent years hoping her son would circle back to a life she'd always preferred for him. I thought about 9 years of midnight client calls and a condo I'd sold to make payroll, and a name that had appeared unceremoniously at the top of a pay cut list. I don't want to destroy the company, I said finally, and I meant it. I built too much of myself into it to want to watch it burn just to prove a point. Understood. That's not actually the strongest play anyway. Destruction gets you nothing but legal fees and headlines. Leverage gets you terms. My advice is this. We send a formal notice to Northbridge's board, not to Derek personally, to the full board, disclosing the IP issue and requesting a negotiated resolution. It puts pressure exactly where it needs to go, and it does it through a channel Derek can't quietly manage or spin in a hallway conversation. Do it. The notice went out 2 days later. I wasn't in the room when the board received it, but Jordan texted me an hour after it landed. 3 words. What is happening? I didn't explain. It wasn't Jordan's to know yet. What I learned secondhand over the following days assembled itself into a picture I could only partially confirm, but which matched everything Renee had told me almost perfectly. The board called an emergency session. Richard Klein, who had spent years staying deliberately invisible in every official document, was suddenly forced to explain, in front of the other directors, exactly how much informal influence he'd been exercising through his daughter's undefined role. A role with no scope, no deliverables, and, as it turned out, direct access to strategic planning documents that should never have been shared with someone outside the executive team without board approval. Derek, for his part, was blindsided twice in the same week. Once by the discovery that his own company's flagship product sat on legally unresolved intellectual property owned by his estranged wife, and a second time by the realization that his mother and Richard Klein had been coordinating behind his back for months in ways he apparently hadn't fully understood himself. He called me that night. I let it ring 3 times before answering, recording as always. Maya. His voice sounded hollowed out, stripped of the composed CEO register he usually defaulted to. Is it true? About the patent? You signed the original assignment agreement yourself, Derek. You'd know better than me whether it's true. I never read that line carefully. I trusted the lawyers. I trusted you. A pause. I trusted us. You trusted that I would never need to protect myself from you, I said. Which, for 9 years, was true. I never thought I'd need this either. You're going to use it against the company? Against everyone who works there? Jordan, Lily, all of them? You'd let it fall apart over this? I'm not the one who built a company entirely dependent on unresolved paperwork, and then decided the person who created the actual foundation of it wasn't worth keeping around, I said. If the company falls apart, it won't be because I filed a legal notice. It'll be because it was never built on solid ground to begin with, and nobody wanted to admit that until now. He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped even lower. Did you know? About Vanessa's father? About my mother? I found out 4 days ago, from someone who cared enough to tell me the truth, which is more than I can say for you. I didn't know, he said, and for the first time in the entire conversation, I believed him. Not because I trusted his judgment anymore, but because the particular kind of shock in his voice wasn't something I thought he could fake. I swear to you, Maya, I didn't know Richard had that kind of stake, or that my mother had been... I didn't know. Then that's its own problem, isn't it? I said quietly. You didn't have to know your family was maneuvering behind your back, because you already trusted the wrong things without ever checking. You didn't check on Vanessa's role before you created it. You didn't check the assignment agreement before you assumed I'd always be covered under it. You didn't check on me, Derek. Not really, not in years. You just assumed I'd always be there, absorbing whatever came, the way I always had. Silence stretched between us, long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. What do you want? He finally asked. Tell me what you actually want, and I'll do it. I want a fair, negotiated licensing agreement for the IP, handled through my attorney and the board with no informal side conversations. And I want a divorce. The second sentence landed in the silence like something dropped from a great height. A divorce, he repeated, voice barely above a whisper. Yes. Maya, I know I got this wrong. Give me a chance to fix it. Not the company. Us. Just us. You had 9 years, I said. You had every single day to choose me the way you promised you would on the floor of that apartment. You chose the bigger picture instead, every time, until the bigger picture didn't have room for me in it at all. I'm not interested in being chosen after the fact, once choosing me became inconvenient for you not to. I hung up before he could answer, and this time when I set the phone down, my hands weren't even slightly unsteady. The weeks that followed moved faster than I expected, in the strange, compressed way that big changes often do once the first domino actually falls. David Okafor negotiated the IP licensing agreement directly with Northbridge's board, cutting Derek almost entirely out of the process after the first meeting. At the board's own insistence, several directors, it turned out, were furious to learn how much undisclosed influence Richard Klein had been exercising, and even more furious to learn that the company's core technology had been sitting on shaky legal ground for 9 years without anyone bothering to fix it. The settlement gave me a substantial one-time licensing payment, an ongoing royalty on the predictive engine's continued use, and a formal, permanent assignment clause going forward that finally closed the gap nobody had bothered to close a decade earlier. I didn't ask for control of the company. I didn't want it. I wanted what I was owed, cleanly, in writing, with no more room for anyone's version of the bigger picture to swallow it later. Richard Klein resigned from the board 11 days after the emergency session, citing in a 2-sentence public statement a desire to focus on other ventures. Nobody believed the 2 sentences, but nobody needed to. The internal fallout had already traveled through the company's grapevine with the speed these things always do, and everyone understood exactly what had actually happened, even if the official language stayed polite. Vanessa lasted a little longer, mostly because Derek, out of some combination of guilt and stubbornness, kept trying to shield her from the consequences of decisions that were never entirely hers to begin with. But the Hale account, the one she'd inherited with none of the context and none of the history, continued to deteriorate. Robert Hale's team asked 3 pointed questions in a single review call. Why the Phase 1 delivery had slipped 2 weeks, why a promised pricing concession had quietly disappeared from the latest draft, why nobody could explain where the newly approved client relationship restoration budget had actually gone, and Vanessa couldn't answer a single one of them. Derek had to step in mid-call to smooth it over, and afterward, according to Jordan, Robert Hale said only one thing before ending the call. "I'm not here to train your new hires." That sentence moved through the strategic accounts department within the hour. 2 weeks after that, Vanessa resigned. Before she left, she posted something on her professional social media, a photo of pink roses on an otherwise empty desk, captioned with a line about how some positions carry more weight than people realize, and how she only ever wanted the chance to prove herself. A few people from Northbridge liked the post out of habit or politeness. Jordan sent me a screenshot with no comment attached, and I didn't need one. I understood exactly what he meant by sending it. I felt no particular satisfaction in any of it, which surprised me less by then than it might have a month earlier. I wasn't trying to watch anyone burn. I was simply, finally, allowed to stop absorbing the weight of things that were never mine to carry in the first place, and everything else was just physics. The natural, unglamorous result of a structure losing its load-bearing wall. The divorce moved forward with far less drama than either of us probably expected, mostly because I refused to let it become a drama at all. I met with a family law attorney, laid out the terms plainly, and declined every attempt Derek made to turn a single conversation into a negotiation for reconciliation instead of separation. He tried twice, once over a stilted, painful dinner he asked me to attend, just to talk, not to fight. And once through a long email, subject line simply, "I'm sorry," that arrived at 11 at night and that I read once, carefully, and then closed without responding. The email was long. He wrote that he'd finally gone back through years of early financial records while preparing materials for the board, and had only then truly understood how much of my own money and how much of my own unpaid labor had quietly propped up the company in its first 2 years. He wrote that being questioned by the board, really questioned, for the first time in his career, about decisions he'd never had to explain to anyone before, had given him some small, uncomfortable taste of what it might have felt like to be me for 9 years, absorbing scrutiny and risk that nobody else in the room ever had to carry. He wrote that he hadn't gone to see Vanessa off on her last day, and that he'd driven past our old house one evening and seen the empty entryway through the window, and understood, for the first time, that a home was never actually held up by the walls of a house. At the very end, he wrote, "Maya, I don't expect you to come back. I just needed you to hear, in my own words, that I know how badly I failed you." I read it once. I didn't reply. It wasn't cruelty that kept me from responding. It was simply that some apologies arrive for wounds that have already finished healing, and reopening a scar for the sake of someone else's closure isn't a kindness you owe anyone, not even a person you once loved for 9 years. At 9 that same night, a text came in from an unknown number. "Maya, it's Vanessa. I'm leaving the city. I used to envy you and be a little afraid of you at the same time, if I'm honest. I understand now that the position I wanted was never one I could actually hold. I'm sorry." I read it once and deleted it. I didn't need to collect an apology from her either. Whatever she'd been chasing had never really been about me at all. It had been about her father's ambitions and her own uncertain place inside them. And I wasn't interested in becoming the final stop on someone else's reckoning tour. That night, the small group chat I kept with Jordan, Lily, and Priya lit up with a photo Priya sent. The 3 of them out for dinner somewhere downtown, laughing over a shared appetizer plate. Lily wrote underneath it, "Turned down an unreasonable request today. Told my director I wasn't taking the blame for someone else's budget decision. Felt incredible. Jordan replied a moment later, "Congratulations! You finally graduated." I sat with my phone in the quiet of my new apartment and found myself smiling for the first time in days. Not because anyone had been punished exactly, but because it turned out that when one person finally draws a real boundary and holds it, the people watching slowly learn how to draw their own. That, more than anything that had happened to Derek or Vanessa or Richard Klein, felt like the actual ending of the story I'd been living inside for 9 years. The first month after I left Northbridge, I was too busy to spend much time looking backward, which turned out to be its own quiet mercy. Robert Hale, true to the kind of relationship we'd built over 3 years, reached out again 2 weeks after our first careful phone call, this time with a different question. "I heard you're not with Northbridge anymore. What are you doing next?" Honestly, I hadn't fully decided. "Would you consider independent consulting?" Not for us specifically, I mean generally. I know 2 other companies who've mentioned more than once that they wished they had someone like you on retainer instead of buried inside a vendor relationship. I hadn't planned to start a company. If anything, after 9 years of building one alongside someone else, the idea of doing it all again, alone, felt exhausting before I'd even begun. But something about the phrase, "someone like you on retainer," stuck with me for days, turning over slowly in my mind the way a small stone does when you can't quite decide whether to keep it in your pocket. I didn't rush into anything. I spent 2 weeks simply sitting with the idea, sketching out, in a notebook rather than a formal business plan, what it might look like to work the way I actually wanted to, advising companies on client strategy and risk without ever again being embedded inside an organization's internal politics, without ever again being one person's assistant, one person's safety net, one person's quiet insurance policy against their own bad decisions. I registered a small consulting practice and called it Ellison Advisory. The name felt deliberate in a way I hadn't expected it to. Not Callahan, not the former head of client strategy at Northbridge Dynamics, just Ellison, my own name, the one that had been sitting quietly on a decade-old patent filing, waiting, it turned out, for exactly this moment to matter again. The day I signed my first independent contract, the room couldn't have looked more different from anything at Northbridge. No glass walls, no 12-person conference table, just a small rented office with good natural light and a single potted fern on the windowsill. The same fern I'd carried out of my old house in a cardboard box on the worst morning of that whole ordeal. But sitting at the head of that small table, signing my own name to my own contract under my own company, I felt a kind of quiet I hadn't felt in years. Not the exhausted calm of having survived another crisis, but something closer to actual peace. The client, a mid-sized logistics firm looking to restructure their enterprise sales relationships, flipped to the last page of the contract before signing it himself. "Ms. Ellison, are you sure you only want to consult? Not build out a full team, take on more accounts, scale this into something bigger?" "I'll consider it eventually," I told him. "But this time, I want to move at my own pace, on my own terms." He nodded slowly, like he was turning that answer over and finding he respected it more than he'd expected to. "It's the pace we're interested in, honestly. We've worked with 3 different firms in the last 2 years that promised the world and delivered a junior associate reading off a template. We'd rather have someone who actually shows up." I signed my name at the bottom of the page. Maya Ellison, not Mrs. Callahan, not the former VP of Client Strategy at Northbridge Dynamics, a title that, by then, had already been quietly reassigned twice in the wake of everything that had happened after I left. Just Maya Ellison, building something entirely her own for the first time in almost a decade. That afternoon, Priya sent me a message from a number I didn't recognize at first, her personal phone, not her old work line. She'd resigned from Northbridge 2 days earlier, she wrote, after watching the fallout from Richard Klein's exit and Vanessa's resignation drag the whole department into a kind of low-grade chaos that no amount of reorganizing seemed able to fix. Lily had also put in her notice, planning to join a smaller fintech company where, in her words, nobody's going to ask me to explain a budget decision that isn't mine. Jordan and Marcus hadn't left immediately, but both had formally requested to be moved off anything connected to the accounts Vanessa had briefly touched. A request the new interim head of client strategy had apparently granted without argument, since nobody wanted to defend those relationships publicly anymore. I read through the messages slowly, sitting alone in my small new office as the late afternoon light moved across the fern's leaves. I felt, for the first time in weeks, something that wasn't grief and wasn't anger and wasn't even relief exactly. Just a kind of settled recognition that the people who had actually mattered to me at Northbridge had, each in their own way and their own time, found the same door out that I had, once they'd seen clearly enough what was on the other side of it. I hired Priya 3 weeks later, once Ellison Advisory had grown past what I could manage alone. She came on as operations lead, and the first thing she did, on her first day, was build a client intake system more organized than anything Northbridge had ever had, joking that she'd spent 5 years dreaming about doing HR and ops the right way, and had simply never had the authority to actually do it before. By the end of the second month, Ellison Advisory had 4 active clients, 1 part-time contractor helping with proposal writing, and a small but growing reputation, built entirely on word of mouth, for being the consultant who actually returned your calls and never once promised something she couldn't deliver. I hadn't set out to build something bigger than what I'd left behind. I'd set out, mostly, to build something that was only ever mine. No husband's name attached to the door, no invisible board member's daughter waiting 2 offices down for the chance to take it from me. No one's version of the bigger picture large enough to swallow me whole again. For the first time in almost a decade, that was enough. I should have known Richard Klein wouldn't simply disappear quietly after resigning from Northbridge's board. Men like him rarely walk away from a loss without trying, at least once, to make someone else pay for it. It started small, in a way that almost didn't register as anything at all. A prospective client, a regional insurance company I'd been in promising early talks with for nearly a month, suddenly went cold, canceling a scheduled call with a 2-line email citing a shift in internal priorities. I didn't think much of it at first. Deals fall through for 100 reasons that have nothing to do with anyone's grudges. Then it happened again with a second prospect, almost identically. Warm, engaged conversations for weeks, followed by an abrupt, vaguely worded cancellation. Priya was the one who noticed the pattern first. "Both of these companies," she said, sliding her laptop across the small conference table so I could see the screen, "have some connection to Klein Capital. The insurance company took a minority investment from them 2 years ago, and the manufacturing group that ghosted us last week, Richard Klein sits on their advisory board." I sat back slowly. "You think he's making calls?" "I think it's a strange coincidence if he isn't." I called David Okafor that evening, less because I thought there was an immediate legal action to take, and more because I wanted a second set of eyes that understood how these things worked from the inside. "It's hard to prove directly," David said, after I'd walked him through it. "If he's making informal calls, a friendly warning here, a quiet suggestion there, That's not the kind of thing that shows up in writing. Men like Richard Klein don't put things like that in email. So there's nothing I can do. There's plenty you can do. You just can't do it by trying to catch him in the act. You do it by making yourself so clearly the better option that a quiet phone call from a bitter former board member doesn't carry enough weight to matter. It wasn't the satisfying answer I might have wanted in a different mood, but it was the correct one, and I knew it, even as I sat with a flash of frustration at hearing it. I spent the next several weeks doing exactly what David suggested, not chasing down rumors, not trying to trace which calls had been made to whom, but simply doing the work in front of me with enough precision and consistency that word started to travel on its own, the old-fashioned way, through satisfied clients telling other companies who they should be calling. It was Robert Hale, in the end, who did more to counter Richard Klein's quiet interference than any legal strategy could have. At an industry dinner I hadn't even been invited to, seated 2 tables away from a Klein Capital portfolio executive who'd apparently been the one relaying Richard's warnings, Robert mentioned, in the easy, unbothered way of a man who has nothing to prove, that Ellison Advisory had handled a delicate account transition for his company with more competence and honesty than any vendor relationship he'd had in a decade. He wasn't defending me on purpose. He was simply telling the truth in a room where the truth happened to travel. Within a week, both of the companies that had gone cold reached back out, one of them apologizing outright for the abrupt cancellation, citing, without quite saying so directly, some outdated information that turned out not to be accurate. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. I simply signed both contracts, thanked them for their continued interest, and moved forward. Because dwelling on Richard Klein's small, bitter attempt to undermine something he no longer had any real power over would have cost me more time and energy than the man himself was worth. What I did learn through Renee, who still texted me occasionally with fragments of family gossip, out of what I now understood was genuine loyalty rather than idle curiosity, was that Richard Klein's attempt to quietly damage Ellison Advisory had not gone unnoticed by the rest of Northbridge's board either. Word had apparently reached them that their recently departed director was still making calls on Northbridge's reputation, informally, in ways that could easily be misread as the company itself trying to retaliate against a former employee turned licensing partner. A perception that threatened to complicate the very licensing agreement the board had just spent weeks carefully negotiating with my attorney. The board, according to Renee, sent Richard a formal, unambiguous letter reminding him that his departure had been voluntary and that any further activity that could be construed as interference with a legally binding partner relationship would be treated as a serious matter. Whatever quiet campaign Richard Klein had been running against me came to an abrupt stop after that. Not because he developed any sudden respect for me, but because even he understood the difference between petty revenge and a fight that could actually cost him something. I didn't feel triumphant about it. Mostly I felt tired, in the particular way you feel tired after realizing, once again, how much energy some people are willing to spend trying to make someone else smaller instead of simply building something of their own. I thought, more than once during those weeks, about how much of my life at Northbridge had been spent absorbing exactly that kind of energy without ever fully naming it, smoothing things over, staying quiet, letting other people's insecurities and ambitions rearrange the furniture of my own career without complaint. Because complaining had always seemed like the thing that would make me difficult, or ungrateful, or not a team player. I wasn't interested in being any of those things anymore. I was interested in building something steady enough that a bitter man's quiet phone calls couldn't shake it. And by the end of that particular stretch, I had. The divorce finalized on a gray Tuesday morning in late winter, almost 5 months after I'd walked out of that conference room. There was no dramatic courtroom scene, no raised voices, nothing that would have made for good television. Just two attorneys, a stack of paperwork, and two people who had once built an entire life together, sitting on opposite ends of a conference table, signing their names to the formal end of it. The prenup, ironically, ended up mattering far less than Derek's mother had probably imagined it would when she'd insisted on it 9 years earlier. It had been drafted at the time almost entirely to protect Northbridge's equity from me, a young, unproven wife with no independent wealth of her own, or so the thinking had gone back then, before anyone understood how much of that unproven young wife's labor and money would eventually hold the company together through its hardest years. The document protected Derek's founder shares and any premarital assets. It said nothing at all about intellectual property I had personally created before the marriage even began, because nobody drafting it had thought to ask whether I'd brought anything of my own into the relationship worth protecting in the other direction. Derek's mother, I later learned from Renee, had been furious when the IP licensing settlement became public knowledge among the family. Not at Derek, not even really at Richard Klein, but at the prenup itself, at the lawyers who'd drafted it, as though the document had somehow betrayed her by failing to anticipate a version of me she'd never once considered might exist. Not a woman trying to take something from her son, but a woman who had brought something valuable into the marriage that nobody had bothered to properly account for. I felt no particular urge to gloat about that either, though I won't pretend there wasn't a small, quiet satisfaction in it. The same kind of satisfaction you feel when a puzzle you'd stopped consciously working on finally clicks into place on its own. The financial settlement itself was straightforward, once both attorneys stopped posturing and simply did the math. I kept the proceeds from the IP licensing agreement, which by then had already grown Ellison Advisory's runway considerably. I waived any claim to Derek's founder equity, not out of generosity, but because I genuinely didn't want it. Owning a piece of a company I no longer trusted felt less like an asset and more like a tether I was actively trying to cut. We split the house's equity evenly, and Derek bought out my half rather than sell it, which surprised me a little, until Renee mentioned, almost in passing, that he'd told his mother he wanted to keep it because it was the last thing that still felt like something real. I didn't know what to do with that information when I first heard it, so mostly I just set it down somewhere quiet in my mind and left it there. The one moment in the entire process that actually rattled me came near the end, after both attorneys had left the room to finalize a document, and Derek and I were alone at the table for the first time in months. "Can I ask you something?" he said, not quite looking at me. "You can ask." If I'd never let Vanessa come back into the company at all, if none of this had ever started, do you think we'd still be sitting here? I thought about it honestly, rather than giving him the easy, cutting answer that would have been simpler to reach for. Maybe not this exact way. Maybe it would have taken longer. But Derek, the problem was never really Vanessa. It was that somewhere along the way, you started believing I would never actually leave, no matter what you did, no matter how many times you chose someone or something else over me and called it the bigger picture. Vanessa was just the moment that finally proved you wrong. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his pen slowly between his fingers. I keep thinking about that apartment, the one before any of this. I meant what I said to you back then, you know, about the brightest seat in the house. I know you meant it at the time, I said, and I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I actually believed that. I just don't think you ever understood that meaning something in the moment isn't the same as choosing it every single day for 9 years, especially on the days it would have been easier not to. He didn't have an answer for that, and I didn't need him to. The attorneys came back a few minutes later with the final paperwork, and we both signed in near silence. And that was, in the end, exactly as anticlimactic as an ending like that should probably be. No shouting, no dramatic final speech, just two signatures and the quiet, almost banal finality of two lives formally uncoupling after 9 years of being braided together. Outside the building afterward, standing on the sidewalk in the thin winter light, Derek lingered near his car instead of getting in right away. "What will you do now?" he asked, the question trailing off before he could finish it properly, as though he wasn't sure he actually had the right to ask. "I'll be fine," I said. It wasn't meant to comfort him. It was mostly meant to remind myself. A car pulled up to take me back to my office, in my own name, on my own schedule. Before I got in, Derek said, almost too quietly to hear over the traffic, "Can I still reach out to you sometime?" I looked at him for a long moment. For business, there's no reason to. For anything personal, even less. He didn't say anything else. I got into the car, and as it pulled away from the curb, I glanced once in the side mirror and saw him, still standing there on the sidewalk, the folder of finalized paperwork held loosely at his side, looking like a man who had just realized, a little too late, that he'd finally lost something he'd never truly believed he could lose. I didn't cry on the ride home. I took out my phone, found his contact, and changed the name from Derek to his full legal name, the way you'd label a file you no longer expected to open very often. Then I unpinned him from the top of my favorites list, and for the first time in months, I let myself simply look out the window at the city passing by, without checking my phone once, for the rest of the drive. Northbridge Dynamics did not collapse outright in the months after I left, though for a while it looked like it might. What actually happened was slower and, in its own way, more damning. A long, grinding erosion of confidence that no single dramatic event could be blamed for, which made it almost impossible for Derek to fix, because there was no single fire to put out. Only 100 small leaks all draining the same tank at once. The Hale account, after the disastrous review call and Vanessa's resignation, stabilized only partially under a new account lead who, according to Jordan, was competent but had none of the deep institutional history I'd built over 3 years. Robert Hale renewed for 1 more year rather than the standard 3. A signal everyone in the industry understood as a company hedging its bets rather than committing. 2 other long-term clients didn't renew at all. A promising expansion into the healthcare vertical, one Derek had personally championed at the same board meeting where my name first appeared on that pay cut list, quietly stalled out after the 2 engineers who understood its technical requirements best both left within a 6-week span, following what Jordan described as a vibe in the building that things weren't stable at the top. I heard most of this the way I heard everything from Northbridge by then, secondhand, filtered through people who still cared enough to keep me loosely informed, not because I asked, but because they seemed to need somewhere to put the story as it unfolded. 6 months after the board's emergency session over Richard Klein's influence, and 4 months after my divorce finalized, Northbridge's board voted to remove Derek as CEO. I learned about it the same way most of the industry did. A terse press release, carefully worded, citing a mutual decision to pursue new strategic leadership as the company enters its next growth phase. Renee texted me an hour after it went out. He didn't see it coming. The vote was 7-2. Even the directors who'd always been closest to him voted against him in the end. I sat with that news for a long time before I felt anything clearly enough to name it. Not joy, not vindication exactly, though there was a thread of something like it woven through the rest. Mostly what I felt was a kind of tired recognition, the particular, almost clinical clarity of watching a structure finally give way under a weight it had been straining against for far longer than anyone inside it had wanted to admit. Derek had spent 9 years building a company on a foundation that included, without his ever fully reckoning with it, my labor, my money, my intellectual property, and my willingness to absorb every risk quietly so that he never had to look directly at how fragile the whole thing actually was underneath its confident surface. Once I stopped absorbing it, the fragility didn't disappear. It simply became visible to everyone else all at once, and a board that had spent years comfortable with Derek's confident narrative discovered, rather abruptly, that the narrative had been resting on load-bearing walls nobody had bothered to inspect. 2 weeks after Derek's removal, I received an email from Northbridge's interim CEO, a board member named Patricia Suarez, who I'd met exactly twice in 9 years, both times briefly, at year-end events where she'd struck me as sharp, unsentimental, and mostly bored by the surrounding theater. "Ms. Ellison," the email began, formal in a way that felt almost refreshing after everything that had come before it. "I'm reaching out directly because I believe Northbridge and Ellison Advisory could benefit from a more structured, ongoing consulting relationship, separate from the existing IP licensing agreement. I've reviewed the account history from your tenure, and I think it's fair to say the company hasn't fully recovered the institutional knowledge it lost. I'd like to discuss terms, if you're open to it." I read the email twice before responding, weighing the strange symmetry of it. The company that had put my name at the top of a demotion list, now formally requesting my help, on my terms, at my rates, through a woman who had clearly done her homework rather than assuming, the way Derek always had, that loyalty could simply be summoned on request. I met with Patricia the following week in a neutral conference room at a hotel rather than at Northbridge's offices, a choice she made without my having to ask for it, which told me something useful about how she operated. "I'll be direct," she said, once we'd settled in. "The board made mistakes. Some of them predate Derek's removal by years, and frankly, some of them are mistakes the board itself is responsible for. Approving budget requests we should have scrutinized more closely, tolerating governance gaps around Richard Klein's involvement that we should have caught much sooner. I'm not here to relitigate any of that. I'm here because the company needs stability in its client relationships, and you're the person who understands those relationships better than anyone currently on staff." "What exactly are you proposing?" "A retainer contract. Ellison Advisory consults on client strategy for our top-tier accounts, reporting directly to me, with full authority to flag risk without it getting filtered through anyone else's politics first. No informal titles, no undefined scope. Everything in writing, everything with clear deliverables." I appreciated, more than I expected to, the deliberate contrast she was drawing. Every phrase in that offer seemed engineered to be the precise opposite of how Vanessa's role had been created, and I understood she designed it that way on purpose, as a kind of unspoken apology dressed up in professional language. I told her I'd consider it, and I meant it honestly, rather than as a polite deferral. It took me several days of real deliberation before I agreed, and even then, I agreed on my own terms. A defined, limited-scope contract, clear boundaries around what Ellison Advisory would and wouldn't take on, and an explicit understanding that I would never again set foot in that building as an employee, only ever as an outside advisor with the power to walk away cleanly if the terms stopped being honored. Patricia agreed without hesitation. It was strange, signing a contract with the company that had once tried to quietly erase me. But it didn't feel like defeat, and it didn't feel like victory either. It felt like something closer to a settled account, A business relationship built on clear terms and mutual respect. The exact thing that had never existed in the version of Northbridge Dynamics I'd spent 9 years inside of. I never asked what happened to Derek after his removal. Renee mentioned once that he'd taken a quiet advisory role at a much smaller startup, something in early-stage fintech, a company far enough from the spotlight that nobody outside a small circle of investors would recognize his name attached to it anymore. I didn't ask for more details, and Renee, sensing that, didn't offer any. By the 1-year mark since I'd walked out of that conference room, Ellison Advisory had grown into something I genuinely hadn't expected it to become that quickly. 11 clients, 4 full-time staff besides myself, and a small but growing office in a converted warehouse building with tall windows and exposed brick. The kind of space I'd always privately wanted for Northbridge and never quite gotten around to pushing for, because pushing for things I wanted for myself had never been high on my own priority list back then. Jordan came on board in month 9, after nearly a year of watching Northbridge continue its slow, uneven recovery under Patricia's more careful leadership. He called me on a Sunday evening, sounding tired in a way I recognized from my own last months at the company. "I keep thinking about something you told me," he said, "about not building my hopes around someone who'd already left. I think I've been doing the opposite this whole time, staying somewhere out of loyalty to what it used to be, instead of what it actually is now." "Northbridge isn't a bad company anymore," I said honestly, because it wasn't, not under Patricia. "It's just not the company you fell in love with when you started." "No," he agreed. "It's not." A pause. "Are you hiring?" I brought him on as a senior account strategist, and within his first month, he'd already restructured our client onboarding process in a way that made me genuinely proud of how far he'd grown since the 24-year-old I'd once mentored through his first major proposal on a red-eye flight years earlier. Marcus joined 2 months after that, once his non-compete cleared. Lily stayed at her fintech job happily, but became one of Ellison Advisory's first clients when her new company needed outside strategic consulting for an enterprise sales restructuring project. A full-circle moment neither of us commented on directly, though I caught her smiling at the irony during our first official kickoff call. Priya, by then, had become indispensable in a way that went beyond her original operations role. She'd built out a small but rigorous internal culture, clear boundaries around working hours, a genuine non-performative openness to pushback from junior staff, transparent compensation bands posted internally so nobody would ever again have to find out about a pay decision by seeing their own name on a slide in a meeting they hadn't been warned about. "I want it written into the culture doc," she told me one afternoon, sliding a draft across my desk. "No compensation changes discussed in group settings before the individual affected has been notified privately, in writing, with adequate notice." I read the line twice, understanding exactly what specific memory had prompted her to write it, and signed off on it without a single word of debate. We built the business slowly and deliberately, the way I'd promised that first client I would, at my own pace, on my own terms. We turned down 2 potential clients whose values didn't line up with ours. One that wanted us to help them quietly restructure a department in a way that felt uncomfortably close to what had happened to me. And another that treated our junior staff with a dismissiveness during the pitch process that told us everything we needed to know about how they'd treat us once the contract was signed. Turning away revenue on principle felt, at first, like an indulgence I wasn't sure I could afford. It became, over time, one of the clearest signals to the market that Ellison Advisory actually meant what it said about how it operated, and the clients who valued that kept referring us to others who valued it too. I thought, more than once during that first year, about how different this all felt from the version of success I'd spent 9 years chasing at Northbridge. Success that had always seemed to require me to be endlessly available, endlessly accommodating, endlessly willing to disappear a little further into the background so someone else's name could sit at the top of the slide. This version of success had my name on the door, and it also, somehow, had more room in it for everyone else's names too. Jordan's, Marcus's, Lily's, Priya's. Because I'd finally understood, the hard way, that building something sustainable had never actually required anyone to make themselves smaller. It had only ever felt that way because I'd been standing inside a structure designed to convince me it did. There were hard days too, and I don't want to pretend the first year of Ellison Advisory was some uninterrupted success story. There was a brutal stretch in the spring when we nearly lost our second largest client over a delivery timeline miscommunication that was, honestly, at least partly my own fault. A scheduling error I hadn't caught in time, born out of taking on more than the team could comfortably handle in an effort to prove, mostly to myself, that leaving Northbridge hadn't been a mistake. I stayed up 2 nights in a row rebuilding the project plan from scratch, the same way I used to for Northbridge, except this time, when I finally called the client at 7 a.m. to walk them through the corrected timeline and offer a fee reduction to cover the disruption, I did it without anyone else's name shielding mine. Without anyone else's approval required first. And the client, to my genuine surprise, stayed. Not because the mistake hadn't mattered, but because I'd owned it, directly, immediately, and without excuse. And it turned out that mattered to people more than perfection ever had. "You know," Priya said to me one evening, both of us still in the office long after everyone else had gone home, boxes of half-eaten takeouts scattered across the conference table. "This is the first place I've worked where a mistake didn't turn into a whole political event. You just said, 'We got it wrong, here's the fix,' and moved forward." "That's the whole plan," I told her, only half joking. "Just do the work and tell the truth about it. Nobody ever explained to me why that was supposed to be complicated." She laughed, tired and genuine, and for a moment, sitting in that warehouse office with its tall windows going dark against the evening sky, I let myself feel, fully and without hesitation, exactly how far I'd come from the woman who had once sat frozen at a conference table, watching her own name appear at the top of a list she'd had no say in. I hadn't spoken to Derek's mother, Eleanor Callahan, a coincidence of names I'd found faintly amusing back when I still had the emotional bandwidth for irony, since she and I shared almost nothing else since the week the divorce finalized. So when she called me directly, 14 months after I'd walked out of that conference room, I almost didn't answer. I picked up mostly out of curiosity. "Maya." Her voice was as composed as ever, the same carefully modulated warmth she'd always used at family dinners, the kind of warmth that had taken me years to recognize as a performance rather than an actual temperature. "I wasn't sure you'd take my call." "I wasn't sure either," I admitted. "What can I do for you, Eleanor?" There was a pause, longer than I expected from a woman who had never, in 9 years, struck me as someone who hesitated before speaking. "I owe you an apology." I've been turning that sentence over for months, trying to figure out how to say it in a way that wouldn't sound self-serving. And I've decided there probably isn't one, so I'm just going to say it plainly. I encouraged Vanessa's involvement with Derek's company. I did it because I wanted, for reasons that had far more to do with my own history than with you, for my son to end up with the life I'd always pictured for him. I told myself for a long time that it wasn't really about you, that it was simply about Vanessa, about an old connection I thought deserved a second chance. But I've had a great deal of time to think about it since, and I don't believe that's true anymore. I think some part of me never fully accepted you, Maya, And I let that quiet refusal shape decisions that ended up costing you a great deal more than I ever intended. I sat with the silence for a moment before responding, surprised at how measured I felt, given how much I might once have wanted to say to her in a moment like this. Why are you telling me this now, Eleanor? It's been over a year. Because Richard Klein's daughter left the country 6 months ago, and my son lost the company he built, and I've spent a great deal of time since then sitting with the fact that I contributed to both of those things, and none of it brought me any of what I actually wanted, which, if I'm honest with myself, for possibly the first time in my life, was simply for my son to be happy. I convinced myself for years that happiness for Derek looked like a particular kind of life, with a particular kind of wife, and I was so certain of my own vision that I never once stopped to ask whether the life he already had, the one he built with you, might have been the actual answer all along. I let out a slow breath. I appreciate you saying that. I do. But I want to be honest with you too. I'm not interested in reconciling with Derek, and I'm not looking for a relationship with you either. Not out of bitterness. I've simply built something new, and it doesn't have room in it for people who only value me in hindsight, once the version of me they preferred didn't work out the way they'd hoped. I understand, she said, and I believed she genuinely did. I'm not calling to ask for anything, Maya. I don't think I have the right to ask you for anything at this point. I just needed to say it, for my own sake as much as yours, and I wanted you to hear it directly rather than through Renee, or through gossip, or through whatever fragments eventually reach you secondhand. We didn't talk much longer after that. Before we hung up, she asked one more question, almost hesitantly, in a tone I genuinely never heard from her before. Are you happy, Maya? Truly? I thought about the question honestly before answering, the way I'd learned to do with most things over the past year, rather than reaching automatically for whatever answer might smooth the conversation along fastest. I'm building something that's entirely mine, with people I trust, on terms I chose. I don't know if that's the same thing as happiness exactly, but it's close enough that I've stopped needing to draw a hard line between the two. That's more than I managed at your age, she said quietly. I hope you hold on to it. After we hung up, I sat at my desk for a long time, looking out the tall warehouse windows at the last light draining out of the sky, turning the conversation over slowly in my mind. I didn't feel triumphant, and I didn't feel moved to forgive her exactly, not in any complete or dramatic way, but I felt something settle, some small, previously unresolved tension finally loosening its grip. Not because she'd earned my forgiveness, but because I no longer needed her apology to matter one way or another to how I felt about my own life. That, I was starting to understand, was the actual marker of having moved on, not the absence of anger, and not some tidy, cinematic reconciliation, just the quiet, undramatic realization that someone else's regret, however sincere, no longer had the power to change anything about the ground I was already standing on. 18 months after I walked out of that conference room, a business journalist named Farah Doyle reached out to Ellison Advisory's general inbox with a request that Priya forwarded to me with a single line of commentary. This one might actually be worth your time. Farah wrote for a well-regarded industry publication, the kind that covered leadership and corporate strategy without leaning into the tabloid instincts that had made me wary of press interest in the past. She wanted to profile Ellison Advisory's growth for a feature on independent consultancies outperforming larger incumbent firms, and she was upfront, in her first email, that she already knew the broad outline of my history with Northbridge Dynamics and wanted to ask about it directly rather than dance around it. I almost declined. For the better part of a year, I'd kept a deliberate distance from anything that might drag my personal history back into public view, preferring to let Ellison Advisory's work speak for itself, rather than becoming, in some journalists' framing, the wronged wife who built a comeback. That narrative, however sympathetic, felt like a cage of its own, a new story other people would tell about me instead of the one I was actually living. But something in Farah's follow-up email shifted my thinking. "I'm not interested in writing a piece about a scorned spouse," she wrote. "I'm interested in writing about a leadership philosophy, the specific choices you made about documentation, boundaries, and clean handovers, which strike me as genuinely instructive for anyone navigating a hostile transition, regardless of the personal details underneath it. If you'd rather not discuss the marriage at all, I'm comfortable working around it." I agreed to the interview on those terms. We spoke for nearly 2 hours in my office, and true to her word, Farah spent most of the conversation asking practical, specific questions: how I'd approach the handover documentation before I even knew I'd need it, how Ellison Advisory structured client onboarding to avoid the kind of ambiguous, undefined roles that had caused so much damage at Northbridge, how I thought about compensation transparency as a structural safeguard rather than just a nicety. I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, genuinely energized by the conversation, less because it let me revisit old grievances, and more because it forced me to articulate, clearly and for the first time, the actual philosophy underneath decisions I'd mostly made on instinct in the moment. "You talk about documentation almost like a form of self-respect," Farah observed at one point, looking up from her notes. "Not just a practical habit." I thought about that for a moment before answering. I think for a long time I believed documenting everything was just about being professional, being thorough. It took me leaving a 9-year relationship, in every sense of the word, to realize it was actually the way I'd been quietly telling myself the whole time that what I did mattered enough to be recorded, even when nobody else in the room seemed to think it did. The piece ran 2 months later under the headline, "The Quiet Discipline Behind Ellison Advisory's Rise," and to my relief, it was exactly as measured and substantive as Farah had promised. It mentioned my departure from Northbridge in 2 careful sentences, framed entirely around the practical lessons rather than the emotional wreckage, and spent the rest of its considerable length on the actual mechanics of how we built the firm. The response surprised me. Within a week, I'd received messages from a dozen women across the industry, most of them in mid-level roles at larger companies, describing some version of the same feeling: the slow, invisible erosion of being treated as infrastructure rather than a person. The discomfort of watching credit and opportunity flow towards someone newer, louder, or better connected, while their own steady contributions went unremarked. Several asked, almost tentatively, if I'd be willing to talk with them directly, not as a formal mentorship, just as someone who'd navigated something similar and come out the other side of it intact. I said yes to more of those conversations than was probably strategic from a pure time management standpoint, but I found I couldn't easily say no. There was something in each of those messages that reminded me, uncomfortably and clearly, of exactly how alone I'd felt in that conference room the morning my name appeared at the top of a slide, and how much it would have meant, back then, to have had even one person outside the situation tell me plainly that what I was experiencing had a name, and that leaving wasn't the reckless, dramatic overreaction it had been framed as by everyone still standing to lose something from my staying. I started hosting a small, informal gathering once a month at the Ellison Advisory office. No formal program, no keynote speeches, just wine and cheese and a room full of women comparing notes on the particular, unglamorous mechanics of protecting yourself inside organizations that had quietly stopped protecting you. Priya started calling it, half-jokingly, the Exit Strategy Club, and the name stuck, though most of the women who attended weren't actually planning to leave anywhere. They just wanted a space to talk honestly about the calculus of staying versus going, the specific, practical steps, the folder of documentation, the clear paper trail, the quiet habit of keeping your own house in order, regardless of how secure your position seemed on any given day, that made either choice possible on your own terms rather than someone else's. A year into hosting those gatherings, one of the regular attendees, a woman named Camille Osei, who ran client operations at a competing consultancy, pulled me aside after everyone else had left. "I wanted to tell you something," she said. "I finally set a real boundary at work last month. Told my director I wasn't going to keep absorbing scope creep without a corresponding raise or a title change, one or the other, and if neither happened, I'd start looking elsewhere seriously. I would never have had the nerve to say that a year ago." "What happened?" She smiled, tired but genuine. "They gave me the title. And I believed, for the first time in 3 years, that I actually deserved it, rather than just being grateful someone finally noticed." I thought about Marcus's message from over a year earlier. "Congratulations, you finally graduated," and felt the same quiet, unshowy satisfaction settle over me again. The specific kind that came not from anyone's downfall, but from watching, slowly and repeatedly, what happened when people around me learned they were allowed to take up more space than they'd been conditioned to think they deserved. It occurred to me, standing in my office that evening after Camille left, watching the last light fade behind the warehouse's tall windows, that this, not the licensing settlement, not Derek's removal as CEO, not any single moment of vindication, was probably the truest measure of everything that had happened since that morning in the conference room. Not what had been taken from the people who wronged me, but what had quietly grown in its place among the people who hadn't. Almost 2 years to the day after I walked out of Northbridge, I received a request for a meeting that I genuinely didn't expect. A formal email, routed through his assistant rather than sent directly, from Richard Klein. I sat with the email for a full day before responding, turning over every possible reason he might want to meet with me now, after everything, and settling finally on the most obvious one: money. Klein Capital, according to a piece of industry news I'd read weeks earlier, had recently closed a new fund and was actively looking for portfolio additions in the enterprise consulting space. Ellison Advisory, by that point, had grown enough to plausibly show up on his radar. I agreed to the meeting mostly out of curiosity, and partly because I wanted, if I'm honest, the specific and slightly petty satisfaction of sitting across a table from him on entirely equal footing, in a room where he had no leverage over me at all. He arrived at our office precisely on time, dressed in the understated, expensive way of a man who had spent decades being underestimated on purpose and had learned to enjoy it. He shook my hand with a firm, easy grip and settled into the chair across from my desk as though we'd never had any history that would make the meeting remotely uncomfortable. "Ms. Ellison, thank you for making the time." "Mr. Klein." I didn't offer him coffee. It wasn't rudeness, exactly. Just a small, deliberate withholding of the kind of hospitality that might have implied we were starting this conversation as anything other than what it actually was. He got to the point quickly, which I appreciated despite everything. "Klein Capital would like to discuss a minority investment in Ellison Advisory. You've built something genuinely impressive here, and our fund is specifically looking for firms with your growth trajectory and reputation." "I'm going to save us both some time," I said. "I'm not interested in taking outside investment from Klein Capital. Not now, and honestly, not ever." His expression didn't change much, though something behind his eyes recalibrated, the look of a man quickly reassessing his approach. May I ask why? We'd offer very favorable terms given the relationship history. Call it good faith. Good faith, I repeated, letting the phrase sit in the air for a moment. Mr. Klein, you spent months quietly maneuvering your daughter into a role at my former company for the express purpose of gaining informal influence over its decisions without proper board disclosure, and when that plan collapsed, you spent several more weeks making quiet calls to try to choke off my new business before it ever had a real chance to grow. I don't think either of us needs to pretend those things happened in good faith. He was quiet for a moment, studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. You're better informed than I expected. I've made a habit of staying well informed. It's served me reasonably well so far. He allowed himself something close to a rueful smile. Fair enough. I'll be direct with you then, since apparently there's little point in being anything else. I misjudged you badly, both times. I assumed when Vanessa took that role that you were exactly what Derek always described you as, an obstacle, competent but replaceable, someone who'd absorbed years of quiet frustration and would eventually just be worn down by attrition. I was wrong about that. And I assumed, when my calls to a couple of your early prospects didn't work, that it was simply a matter of applying more pressure elsewhere. I was wrong about that too. You built something more durable than I gave you credit for, on both counts. I appreciate the honesty, I said, and meant it, even if it didn't particularly move me. But it doesn't change my answer. I don't do business with people who've already shown me, twice, exactly how they operate when they think they can get away with it quietly. He nodded slowly, gathering the folder he'd brought with him, apparently understanding there was no further ground to be gained in the conversation. At the door, he paused. For what it's worth, Ms. Ellison, my daughter is doing well, wherever she's landed. I know that's probably not something you particularly wanted to hear, but I thought you should know the fallout from all of this didn't destroy her either. She's building something of her own now, too, apparently, far away from any of this. I'm glad to hear it, I said, and I was, in the distant, uncomplicated way you can be glad for the well-being of someone whose specific choices had once cost you a great deal, without that gladness requiring any warmth toward the person who'd enabled those choices in the first place. After he left, I sat at my desk for a long time, looking at the closed door, feeling something settle inside me that was quieter and more complete than I expected. I hadn't needed to humiliate him, or extract an apology, or extend any particular grace. I had simply needed to say no, clearly and without hedging, to a man who had once assumed I would never have the standing to say no to him at all. Priya knocked and stuck her head in a few minutes later. How'd it go? He offered to invest. I declined. She raised an eyebrow. That's a significant amount of capital to turn down on principle. It is, I agreed, but some money isn't worth what it would cost to take it. She nodded slowly, understanding exactly what I meant without needing further explanation, and closed the door behind her, leaving me alone again with the last of the afternoon light and the quiet, settled certainty that I had, finally and completely, stopped needing anyone's approval, least of all his, to know the value of what I'd built. Somewhere in the second year, without any single dramatic turning point I could point to afterward, I noticed that I had stopped measuring my days against the life I used to have. For a long time after the divorce, I'd caught myself doing it constantly, almost involuntarily, walking into a client meeting and thinking, unbidden, about how Derek would have handled the same room, or hearing a piece of industry news and wondering, before I could stop myself, whether Northbridge would be affected by it. It wasn't longing, exactly. It was more like the way your tongue keeps finding the gap where a tooth used to be, checking, almost against your will, that the absence is still there. At some point, I simply stopped checking. I found a small apartment near the office, nothing extravagant, but with good light and enough space for the fern, which had, against all my previous track record with houseplants, not only survived but thrived, sprouting new fronds so steadily that I eventually had to repot it twice. I framed my grandmother's photo on the nightstand, the same one I'd carried out of the old house in a cardboard box, and next to it, I kept a small leather notebook, the one I'd first sketched Ellison Advisory's earliest ideas into, back when it had been nothing more than a private daydream I wasn't sure I had the nerve to pursue. I hadn't set out to build any kind of new romantic life. For the first year, the idea felt almost beside the point, something happening at the far edges of a picture I was still mostly focused on repainting from the center outward. But somewhere in the second year, a friend from an old graduate cohort introduced me to a structural engineer named Theo Marsh over dinner at a mutual friend's apartment in the low-key, unglamorous way these things sometimes happen when nobody's actively trying to orchestrate them. Theo was steady in a way I hadn't fully realized I'd been missing until I was sitting across from him. Not steady in the performative, controlled way Derek had always projected in boardrooms, but steady in a quieter, more consistent sense, the kind that showed up in small things. He asked real questions and actually listened to the answers. He remembered, 3 weeks after I'd mentioned it once in passing, the exact date of a client pitch I'd been nervous about, and texted that morning just to ask how it had gone. I moved slowly with him, more slowly than I think either of us fully expected, cautious in a way that had less to do with him specifically and more to do with the general, hard-won caution of someone who had spent 9 years mistaking someone else's confidence for reliability. But he never once pushed against that caution, never made me feel like my slowness was a problem he needed to solve or a defense he needed to dismantle. He simply waited, consistently, in the unhurried way that eventually taught me, more than any conversation ever could have, the actual difference between being chosen and being managed. "You don't have to keep proving anything to me," he told me once, several months in, after I'd apologized, again, for pulling back after a particularly good week together, some old reflex insisting that things going well was inherently suspicious, a setup for a fall I needed to brace against in advance. "I'm not going anywhere just because you had a good week and let yourself enjoy it." I didn't fully believe him at first. It took time, real time, not a single cinematic realization, but a slow accumulation of ordinary days where he simply kept showing up, exactly as he said he would, before some old, tightly wound part of me finally started to loosen its grip. I want to be honest in telling this, that I don't think Theo repaired anything that Derek broke. Not in the tidy, redemptive way these stories sometimes get told. I think what actually happened was simpler and less romantic than that. I did the repair work myself, slowly, mostly alone, in 100 small, unglamorous decisions about boundaries and self-respect, and refusing to shrink myself for anyone's convenience. And Theo simply happened to be a steady, patient presence alongside that work, rather than the cause of it. I've come to think that's an important distinction, one I wish someone had explained to me clearly at 26, before I ever met Derek at all. Nobody else can do that particular repair work for you, no matter how much they love you. They can only stand beside you, patiently, while you do it yourself. My mother, visiting for a weekend that spring, sat across from me at my small kitchen table and studied me for a long moment before saying, almost offhandedly, You look like yourself again. I don't think I realized how long it had been since you looked like that." I asked her what she meant. "You used to have this way of taking up space when you talked," she said. "Even as a teenager, you'd get excited about something and just fill the room with it. No apology for it at all. Somewhere in your late 20s, that stopped. You got smaller, quieter. I told myself it was just you getting more mature, more professional. And maybe some of it was. But watching you now, these last few months, I think I finally understand what actually happened. You'd been making yourself smaller for a long time, and you didn't even fully notice you were doing it." I sat with that for a while after she left, turning it over the way I'd learned to turn over most hard truths by then, not rushing to argue with it or explain it away, just letting it settle until I could see clearly whether it was true. It was true. I hadn't consciously chosen, at any single point, to make myself smaller for Derek, for Northbridge, for the accumulated weight of 9 years of being useful, reliable, endlessly accommodating. It had simply happened, gradually, the way water wears down stone, so slow you never notice the shape changing until, one day, you look in a mirror and don't quite recognize the outline anymore. Rebuilding that shape back to something resembling my actual size took longer than the business did, longer than the divorce, longer even than watching Northbridge finally reckon with everything it had built on unstable ground. But it happened in the end, in the same unglamorous, incremental way most real change happens, not in a single dramatic confrontation, but in 1,000 small, ordinary decisions to stop apologizing for the space I actually needed to take up in my own life. I saw Derek again, for the first time in nearly a year, at an industry conference downtown, almost exactly 2.5 years after I'd walked out of that conference room. I hadn't expected him to be there. The event was a mid-sized gathering focused on enterprise strategy and client operations, the kind of conference Ellison Advisory now regularly got invited to speak at, but not the kind of thing I associated with Derek's post-Northbridge career, which, from what little I'd heard through Renee, had settled into a quieter, far less visible role advising early-stage companies rather than running one himself. I was there to close out the afternoon program, signing a formal partnership agreement on stage with a national retail chain that had spent the last 6 months in careful, deliberate negotiations with Ellison Advisory over a company-wide client strategy overhaul. The kind of contract that would have been unthinkable for a firm my size to land 18 months earlier. And the kind of validation that, I noticed with some surprise, no longer felt like it required anyone else's recognition to feel real. I spotted Derek in the audience about halfway through the signing, seated a few rows back, noticeably thinner than I remembered, dressed more simply than the tailored, deliberate style he'd always favored as CEO. He wasn't there to see me specifically, as far as I could tell. He seemed to be attending in some quieter advisory capacity himself, tucked into the audience rather than up on any stage. When the spotlight hit me during the signing, I found myself thinking, unexpectedly, of that apartment floor 9 years earlier, and the specific promise he'd made me back then about the brightest seat in the house. It didn't sting the way I might have expected it to, even a year earlier. It simply arrived, sat with me for a moment, and passed, the way memories eventually do, once they've finished doing whatever work they still needed to do inside you. The truth I understood clearly by then, standing in an actual spotlight of my own making, rather than one anyone had promised to eventually hand me, was simpler than either of us had ever articulated back on that apartment floor. Nobody gives you the brightest seat in the house. You build your way into it yourself, one deliberate decision at a time. And if you wait around for someone else to hand it to you, you can end up waiting an entire decade past the point it should have become obvious that the handoff was never actually coming. After the signing and the applause, as I made my way off the stage and through the crowd toward the reception, Derek was waiting near the end of the hallway, off to the side, not blocking my path, just present. The way he used to stand at the edge of a room when he wanted to talk to me, but didn't want to make a scene of approaching directly. Maya. I stopped, though not out of any particular obligation, more out of the simple, uncomplicated curiosity of someone who no longer had anything to fear from the conversation. He was holding a slim folder, which he extended toward me a little awkwardly. I had the attorneys finalize this months ago, but I wanted to hand it to you directly rather than just mail it. It's the final calculation on everything you put into Northbridge in those first 2 years. The condo sale, the unpaid overtime documented in the early financial records, all of it, plus interest. And the remaining vested options from before the divorce settlement, fully liquidated per the agreement. It's yours. You earned every bit of it. I opened the folder briefly, confirmed the numbers matched what David's firm had already independently calculated during the settlement, and closed it again. Thank you. He studied me for a moment, something unreadable moving across his face. You look good, Maya. Really good. Not just, I don't mean it like that. I mean you look like someone who's actually doing well. It's a different look than I remember. I am doing well, I said, without hedging, without softening it for his benefit the way I might once have instinctively done. He gave a small, tired smile, more resigned than bitter. I used to think you couldn't leave Northbridge, and underneath that, honestly, I think I believed you couldn't leave me either. I don't think I ever said that out loud to myself, until long after you'd already proven both assumptions wrong. I used to believe the same thing, I admitted. For a long time, I don't think I could have imagined a version of my life that didn't have you and that company built into the center of it. And now? I thought about the question honestly before answering. Now, I understand that people only really become themselves once they leave the places that were quietly asking them to be smaller. Someone called my name from further down the hallway, a member of the retail chain's leadership team, waiting to introduce me to a few more people before the reception wound down. I glanced toward the sound, then back at Derek. I have to go. He nodded, but didn't move right away, still holding himself in that same, slightly awkward, uncertain posture. For what it's worth, he said, quieter now. I hope this, all of it, is everything you wanted it to be. I didn't answer that directly. Instead, I said the thing I'd actually been carrying, unspoken, for longer than I'd realized. I hope you learn to actually see the people standing next to you, Derek. Not after they've already left, while they're still there. It wasn't cruelty, and it wasn't quite forgiveness either. It was simply the truest thing I had left to say to him. The last remaining weight I'd been carrying from those 9 years, finally set down in a hotel hallway between two people who had once built an entire life together and now had almost nothing left to say to each other beyond that. I turned and walked toward the reception without waiting to see his reaction. And this time, he didn't call my name, didn't reach for my arm, didn't try to close the distance between us the way he once would have. Out of habit, out of the old certainty that I would always eventually turn back toward him if he simply pushed hard enough. I didn't turn back. I didn't need to anymore. Whatever I'd once been looking for in that direction, I'd long since learned how to build for myself, and it turned out, in the end, to be sturdier and far more mine than anything he could ever have handed me. Ellison Advisory moved into a larger office space about a month after that conference, 3 floors of a renovated building downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the space with natural light for most of the day. It wasn't the biggest firm in the city, and I had no particular ambition for it to become that. But it had grown into something steady, something real, something that carried my own name at the top of its letterhead and, underneath that name, a genuine, carefully built culture that Priya, Jordan, Marcus, and a growing team of people I trusted had all helped shape into existence. I set the fern by the new office's largest window, the same plant I'd carried out of my old marital home in a cardboard box on the worst morning of the whole ordeal. And by then, it had grown large enough that I'd had to move it into a much bigger pot, its fronds spilling generously over the sides. When Megan, a young analyst we'd hired the previous spring, sharp and a little shy in the way I remembered being myself at that age, stopped by my office one afternoon and noticed the plant, she said admiringly, "That's the healthiest fern I've ever seen. What's your secret?" I smiled. It can thrive pretty much anywhere, as it turns out. You just have to give it real light and stop moving it around out of fear every time things get a little uncertain. She nodded seriously, missing the layer of meaning underneath the words, and said, "I guess anything you take care of properly ends up thriving." I looked at the new growth on the fern's outer edges for a long moment, feeling a kind of clarity settle over me that had taken years to fully arrive at. For most of my adult life, I had been the one doing the sheltering, shielding Derek from the company's early risks, shielding his family's fractures from public view, shielding Vanessa's incompetence from consequence long after I had any real reason to, shielding a marriage from a rot that had, if I was honest with myself, set in years before that final conference room ever happened. I had spent 9 years being the reliable, weatherproof structure everyone else got to stand safely behind, without anyone ever once asking who was supposed to be sheltering me. It had taken losing all of it at once, the job, the marriage, the entire architecture of a life I'd spent nearly a decade building around someone else's ambitions, to finally understand something that felt, in hindsight, almost embarrassingly simple. You cannot spend your whole life being someone else's fallback plan without eventually discovering you have no path of your own left to walk. I wasn't anyone's bigger picture anymore. I wasn't anyone's safety net, wasn't anyone's quiet insurance policy against their own decisions, wasn't the name conveniently missing from an announcement while someone else took the credit for the years of work underneath it. I was Maya Ellison, and the company on the door was mine, built from the ground up on terms I had chosen deliberately, brick by brick, after everything else had been taken apart. Some evenings, closing up the office after everyone else had gone home, I still thought about that morning in the old North Bridge conference room. The hum of the projector fan, my name in bold at the top of a slide, the particular silent moment when I understood, with total clarity, that 9 years of building a life alongside someone had somehow left me standing entirely alone in the one place I'd least expected to be abandoned. I don't think that memory will ever fully stop being part of me. I'm not sure I'd want it to. It was the exact moment the old shape of my life finally broke open enough to let a truer one take its place. But I don't live inside that memory anymore. I live here, in an office full of natural light, surrounded by people who show up for each other without needing to be asked twice, building something that has room in it for every name attached to it, mine included, without any of us needing to disappear into someone else's bigger picture to make space for it. I am not looking back. I am simply, finally, moving forward, on my own pace, on my own terms, into a life that is, at long last, entirely and unmistakably my own.